Our top stories. On the front line, Ukrainian soldiers dig in northwest of the capital Kiev with Russian forces circling the city.
There's a tangible fear in this place that Russian offensive, which has been stalled, may be ready to regain momentum.
America says it's banning imports of Russian oil and gas as Britain and the EU also target Moscow's energy exports.
We are enforcing the most significant package of economic sanctions in history, and it's causing significant damage to Russia's economy.
After days of shelling, a temporary ceasefire means thousands of Ukrainians and international students are able to escape the besieged city of Sumy.
It was so terrible, and I left my parents in Sumy. I hope I will see them another time.
In Russia itself, more protests against the war despite the threat of prison, and more global companies, including McDonald's, halt trade in the country. Hello, thanks very much for joining us. We're going to take you through some of the major developments in Ukraine, from the safe passage at last for thousands of women and children in some of the besieged cities in the country, to the stepping up of Western sanctions on Russia. That certainly moved on apace on Tuesday. Washington banned all imports of Russian oil and gas. Britain announced that it will be phasing out oil imports from Moscow, and the EU said it would reduce its considerable dependence on Russian gas by some 2/3. On the military front, well, Poland says it's ready to hand over all its Russian-made MiG-29 fighter jets to the United States so that they can be used by Ukraine. As for the business world, will McDonald's and Coca-Cola add their names to a growing list of big Western companies to suspend operations in Russia?
Let's have a look at this morning's front pages, which are expected are entirely dominated by the war in Ukraine. The Financial Times, first of all, leads with the US decision to ban Russian oil imports, and also mentions the UK's decision to do the same. The Guardian calls that news a blow to Putin. The Metro reacts to the speech given to the House of Commons by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky with the headline, "Hear, hear, hero." The Eye quotes from that address, "We will fight in the forests and on the streets." That is the main story too in today's Mail. Plus the Mirror, "We will never surrender," it says. And again in the Express. The Telegraph leads with the offer from Poland to supply Ukraine with MiG fighters to tackle the Russian assault from the air. The Times has that story too, pointing out that it risks even greater confrontation between NATO countries and Russia. While the Star has an interview with the Ukrainian former boxing star Vladimir Klitschko on the front line, defending his country in what he calls the biggest fight of his life. And The Sun has a story of an unnamed 19-year-old Coldstream Guardsman who the paper is choosing not to name, but has reportedly gone AWOL in order to fight in Ukraine.
Our headlines for you today. Thousands of civilians have been evacuated from areas under siege from Russian forces, but efforts to move people out of the southern city of Mariupol have failed for a fourth day.
It was so terrible, and I left my parents in Sumy. I hope I will see them another time.
Russia says its troops will stop firing in the next hour for people to leave cities, including Kyiv. But there's been no confirmation on that from Ukraine.
Here in Calais, refugees from Ukraine have been told there'll be no visas to enter the UK issued here. Back home, the government's been told to get a grip.
Good morning. The UK and the US unite to ban Russian oil, targeting the main artery of Russia's economy. But will it do the job? And what could it do to prices over here?
Let's get right up to date with everything that has been happening overnight in Ukraine. James Reynolds is here to run through all the details. What's the latest, James?
Thanks to you both. Well, it is, of course, the 14th day of the Russian invasion. And let's just give you an upsum of where the country stands. The bits in red are the bits controlled by Russia, or where Russia is advancing. In particular, it has advanced in the south and is still preparing, we think, attacks against Kiev and Kharkiv in the north there. Well, this morning, there have been reports of air raid sirens in several Ukrainian cities, including the capital, Kiev. And people there know that if they hear one of these, they have to get into the basement, they have to stay off the streets. But what's fascinating about these pictures, filmed in the morning, look, there's nobody there now. A lot of people have left the city. A lot of people know that the safest place, even early morning, is in a basement, in a tube station, or so on. The safest place is off those streets when the air raid warden sirens. Well, Russia has proposed a number of humanitarian corridors. Basically, these are escape routes for civilians. And yesterday, as you can see here, this convoy of buses was a lifesaver for about 5,000 people in the northwestern city of Sumy. They were able to get out. They had about a 12-hour window to get out there. And that evacuation, the one you're seeing there, will continue today. And Russia is also proposing further routes in the north, in Chernihiv, in Kharkiv, in the capital, Kiev, and also in the southern city of Mariupol. And this last city in the south has been besieged and bombarded. Many Ukrainians, though, will only feel safe once they've left the country entirely. More than 2 million of them have decided to do so far. A lot of them have ended up in Poland, 1.2 million, some in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and others are trying to head further into Western Europe. Only a few have made it into the UK. Well, Poland isn't just hosting refugees, it's also suggesting ways to arm Ukraine. It's offered to send all of its Russian-made MiG-29 fighter jets to a US airbase in Germany as a kind of launch pad for possible missions by Ukrainian pilots. The US, though, is extremely reluctant to get drawn into this plan. It's worried about doing anything that might lead to a direct war over Ukraine between US forces and Russian forces. Both of those, of course, are nuclear powers. In the last few minutes, we've heard that the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, will travel to Turkey later today for talks with his Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba. That's according to a Russian state news agency. Those would be the highest-level talks since the invasion began. And John O'Salley, that's how things look this morning.
Well, our correspondent Jenny Hill is in Moscow for us this morning to try and give us a sense of the feeling in Russia. And, of course, Russia becoming increasingly isolated because of the sanctions and businesses pulling out. Jenny, how's that being received on the streets in Moscow?
Well, Russians certainly can't fail to notice that their country is increasingly isolated. Already, if you go into a shopping centre, you'll see Western stores with their shutters down as more and more companies pull out. But overnight, we've heard from really big Western brands, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, L'Oreal, they're all pulling out of the country. And McDonald's, this is a really big deal for Russians because McDonald's, for so many people here, was seen as a real symbol of a new relationship with the West when it first set up shop here in Russia, when the Iron Curtain collapsed at the beginning of the 90s. So that is something that people are noticing. They're noticing other things too, Russia not participating in major sporting tournaments, that kind of thing. But the Kremlin is keeping a really tight control on how this is being explained to people. So the morning papers are full of how these kind of sanctions and actions are going to hurt the West more than they're going to hurt Russia. The Kremlin is trying to mitigate the effects of sanctions, so people with foreign currency bank accounts are now being restricted as to how much they can withdraw. The Moscow Stock Exchange is only going to be partially trading today. And ultimately, I think that people here will be told by the Kremlin, if they do start to suffer in the way that analysts say they will, real economic hardship for your average Russian, that this is another example of Western aggression against Russia.